Om Prithvi Shantirantarikshagam Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragnish Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato ma Satkamaya Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today an important section in this book, Looking Deeply, Vivekachudamani, where the teacher begins answering the student's question, what is the non-self? The Sanskrit word for non-self is anatma. The self is atma. Non-self, you add a prefix called an. So an plus atma becomes anatma. The central premise of Vedanta is that our true nature is the Atman. In reality, we are the infinite being. We are birthless and deathless. And yet, that is not what our present experience is. And that is because we have been covered by different layers or coverings which hide our true nature. And this covering over us is the non-self. The self, the Atman, is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. So we are a little bit handicapped there because those are the only instruments we have. We have the senses and we have the mind. Neither of these can see the Atman. But what they can see, what they can grasp, is the non-self. And so, if we have to see the self, then we'll have to remove the covering over it. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna once gave this example, and he didn't make it very philosophical. He simply covered his face with a cloth like this. And then he said, you can't see my face now, but in order to see my face, you have to remove this cover. then you can see the faith. So that's essentially the thing. The Atman is covered by this non-self. Now, in general, we know the characteristics of the non-self. It's material, just like this world is a material world filled with atoms and molecules, which follows the laws of matter. This non-self covering over the Atman is also material. We kind of know the broad outlines. Now what the teacher will show is how that non-self, how that anatma is visualized or is characterized in the book, so that if we can identify this, then we know this is not the self. So first now there will be the description of what is not the self. And so all that we have to do is look at that and say, okay, this is not Atma. And the idea is, everything that is not the Atman, if I say, this is not the Atma, this is not the Atma, this is not the Atma, a time will come when everything that is not the Atma will have gone out of the way. And then the only entity that will remain is the Atma. That's the process now. Removing the covering in order to see the reality. Now, it's the broad outlines I have already mentioned to you. Self covered by the non-self. But in order to understand it deeper, it's helpful to dissect it. You see, even in a laboratory, when you have an unknown object, and if the scientists want to know what that object is, simply looking at that object from outside, you get some idea. But if you want to know that object in depth, then you need to dissect it and see. Let me cut it this way and what do I see? Let me cut it in the other way and see what I see. So essentially that is what is being done here. So all this covering, we are going to dissect those coverings and see what we find. Now, there are two ways of dissecting them, two ways of analyzing them. And the words that are used in the book is, either we can categorize these coverings into 3 sections or in 5 sections. Some of you may have read the recent blog that I wrote about masks. Masks we are all familiar with nowadays because of the times in which we live. But these covering, the non-self, can be seen as a mask that covers the self. And so these masks which cover the self can be seen in at least 2 ways. We can see them either as 3 coverings over the Atman or 5 coverings. So the word that is used for these 3 coverings in Sanskrit is Sharira. Now Sharira, etymologically, in Sanskrit, it means that which wears away. Shiryate iti shariram. So the characteristic of Sharira is that it will gradually change, keep on changing. There'll be, as we know from our own experience about the human body, that there is birth, then there is growth, then the body grows, there is a period on which it is sustained, maintained, then gradual transformations start occurring, and then we find a decline in the body. Ultimately, apakshiyate, and there are these 6, they are called shadvikaras, 6 changes that occur in the body. And that's described in the book, and we will come across them. So, Sharira, which often gets translated into English generally as body, and this is going to sound a little bit odd because of the way we translate it as body. So there are these 3 layers or 3 shariras, and so we really have 3 bodies. So that's one way of again, I know because of the word body, we understand just one thing, And so the translation into sharira, into body, can sound odd. We said we have 3 bodies. But the other way of dissecting these coverings is into 5 segments, 5 parts, 5 layers. And if we do it in 5 layers, then they have a different name for it. They call it kosha. Now, kosha can mean a layer, it can mean a sheath. Again, translated in different books in different ways. So these next set of verses that we are going to study now, from verses 72 through 123. So it's almost 50 verses. They will describe these 3 shariras. The 3 bodies, to kind of briefly give you a summary of what it is. Many of you are probably already familiar with this. The 3 bodies are the gross body, the subtle body, and the causal body. The gross body in Sanskrit is called sthula sharira. The subtle body is called sukshma sharira. And the causal body is called karana sharira. Sthula sharira, the gross body, is what I see when I stand before a mirror. The sukshma sharira, the subtle body, is all those parts of my personality which are not part of the gross body. So that will be the mind, the intellect, the ego, the hopes and fears and emotions and memories. All of these things are so subtle, no surgeon will find when my body is cut open, but they are parts of me. So all these invisible, subtle parts of my being are grouped together, and they are called a part of this subtle body. Now, the gross body has a certain lifespan. So when we say death, what happens in death is this gross body disintegrates. It's no more functional. It ends, if you like. Or, well, considering the law of conservation of matter, doesn't disappear into nothingness. It just ends up into a heap of ashes or a heap of dust, which probably can go into some garden, and maybe some fresh flowers can come out of those things. So it is preserved, but not in the form in which it was. The subtle body survives death. So when a person dies, the subtle body doesn't die. And this gross body, which is finished, is replaced by another gross body in the next birth. So the subtle body, the mind that you and I have right now, it did not start with our birth. The mind that we have has been with us God knows how long. So it's been with us for a long time. It's not exactly an eternal companion, but has been a companion for a long time. And because we cannot get rid of the mind as easily as the body, well, the body is going to go away anyway, whether we like it or not, sometime or the other. But the mind, because it's going to be with us for a longer time, we need to take care of both body and mind, but we need to take special care of the mind, because the mind is going to be with us for a long time. And causal body, just by the word cause, is the cause of these both bodies. And in plain terms, it simply means ajnana, ignorance, or maya, because ultimately everything has evolved out of ignorance. So these are the 3 layers. Now this will be discussed in greater detail in the verses that we will study today. So let's begin with verse 72. Majjasti medav palarakta charmat tvagavatyair thatu bhire bhiranvitam padoru vaksho bhujaprushtamastakai rangai rupangai rupayuktametat aham mameti pratitam shariram mohaspadam sthulamitiryate budhaihi. According to the wise, the gross body is made of these components: marrow, bones, fat, flesh, blood, skin, and cuticle, and consisting of these limbs and their parts: legs, thighs, the chest, arms, the back, and the head. It is viewed as I and mine and is the cause of delusion. So, plain and simple, clearly, all the parts of the body are not mentioned, just a few parts. If you want to have a more detailed explanation, you simply need to open any good book on human anatomy to understand what's going on. It's a pretty complicated thing inside. So, this is the gross body. The second part of this verse is Aham mameti pratitam shariram. We look upon this body as I and mine. I is aham, mine is mama. That's why they say ahamta and mamata. Mamata sometimes gets translated into some Indian languages as sometimes as compassion, but also mamata, that the idea of belonging or possessing. So that is how our attitude towards our body is. And these views of I and mine are not fixed. They're kind of very dynamic. They keep on changing. The same thing sometimes we refer to as I, and the same thing sometimes we refer to as mine. So let's say if I hurt my leg, if I'm walking, and then and if someone asks me, I can say, oh, I'm hurting. I could say I'm hurting. And then some other time I can say, oh, my leg hurts a lot. So you see, I'm referring to the same thing, but sometimes I say I'm in pain, or sometimes I can say my leg hurts a lot. So that's how you see I and mine. The event is the same. What has occurred is the same. But sometimes I might say I, sometimes I might say mine. That is true with regard to everything connected to our body. And we don't even realize how effortlessly we move from referring to sometimes as I, sometimes as mine. We don't generally do that with things and people other than my body, generally. But in extreme cases, sometimes that shift can occur. For instance, now, if someone's house is on fire, or these hurricanes and tornadoes, we know how much havoc they can create, and we know people have lost entire houses. So it's possible that in that moment of extreme despair and grief, someone comes and finds the whole house has been uprooted, and they can say, I'm ruined. Now, actually, in effect, the house is ruined. My house is gone. My house is destroyed. But that pain can be so much, I can just feel, I am destroyed. So that which was mine, I have it's almost like in that moment of anguish, that moment of this thing, that what was mine has become me. So this kind of shifting between I and mine occurs all the time. But it happens mostly with our own body. And of course with the mind as well, as we will see later. Let's see verse 73 and 74. Nabho nabhasvat tahanambu bhumayah sukshmani bhutani bhavanti tani parasparam shair militani bhutva sthulani cha sthula sharira hetavah matrastadiya vishaya bhavanti shabdadayah pancha sukhaya bhoktuhu. Space, air, fire, water, and earth are the subtle elements. Intermixing of these makes them tangible, and these become the cause of the gross body. The 5 sense impressions, sound and the rest, become the objects for the experience of the self. So there is a lot here. So here is this gross body. We can see, we all are aware, as I said, something that we see when we stand before a mirror. Now, how is this body made up of? What are the materials that make up this body? And the verse begins by first pointing out that the primary materials are the subtle elements. They are called the 5 tanmatras. The word for subtle element in Sanskrit is called tanmatra. That means, well, it will be difficult to translate tanmatra. Simply means, well, I don't know. I simply just call it tanmatra. So the way to describe it is, this is the subtle form of the element. So when it is space, it's not the space or whatever you imagine by space. This is the subtle form of space which you cannot even imagine. Same thing with regard to all these other things: air, fire, water, earth. So while the terms are familiar, while we are also familiar with corresponding objects, remember that all of these are in their very nascent stage, very subtle stage. And that's why they are sukshma. You cannot see them, you cannot even imagine them. Okay. Now, intermixing of these makes them tangible. So there is a process by which these subtle elements, sukshma elements, they combine with one another. And that which is tangible comes from the intangible. Now, if we have some amount of a science background, then we might say, how do they mix? In what order do they mix? Is there any rule behind it? These are the kind of questions we are likely to ask. Not just we. These are the kind, not just in, say, modern science. These kind of questions came in the minds of people centuries ago as well. And that is why a kind of a process is described. Not as a dogma, not like this is exactly how it happens. The answer is, the subtle element, we don't see them. And the answer, all that we know is the gross comes from the subtle. The tangible comes from the intangible. And that's what we see even in life. Before an object comes before us and we are able to hold it, if you see the constituents of these things, if it's a metal, that metal was somewhere in some mine. It had to be someone had to go dig it up and do all the refining and all the everything ultimately for this beautiful little object in our hand. So it's always from the subtle that the gross comes. That's what we know. But to satisfy our curiosity, or at least to have some answer, even if it may not be a very definitive answer, so the books describe a process that is, in Sanskrit, it is called panchikarana. Now, it might have been easier to describe it if I had a chart or something behind me, but I don't think we need to go too much into detail about it, because this is just one explanation. And whether you understand it or not, whether you care for it or not, or whether you want to imagine some different process, go ahead and do it. These people are not very dogmatic about saying this is the only way it happens. But it's kind of interesting. So essentially, think about it this way. Okay. So if you think about each of these subtle elements as let's say 100 cents, which will make $1. So each element is 100 cents, okay? Each of the subtle elements. Now, if I want to make this subtle space into tangible space, what needs to happen? I will take 50, listen carefully, or don't listen if you're not interested in this thing. But this, you take 50 cents of space and so there are four other elements. You take in metric system it becomes a little complicated. So take 12.5 cents of every other element. Essentially, the remaining 50 cents will comprise the remaining 4 elements equally. So the tangible, the gross space, is half of it is the subtle space, and the other half are these 4 elements in equal proportion. So the space that is tangible really has all of these subtle elements, except that the space element is in a larger proportion. The same is true with air, fire, water, and earth. So that process by which the subtle becomes the gross is a way of, that's what is called here by intermixing of these. That's it. The other important thing to remember is the 5 sense impressions. As you see in the note given below, it's sound, sight, smell, taste, and touch. So these sense impressions have also come from these elements. Remember, other than the Atman, everything is material. The sense objects, the sense impressions, everything is material. Now, each of these elements is associated with each of these sense impressions. What it means is sound, shabda, is connected with space. Air is connected with touch. And I mean, logically you can kind of understand, because the presence of breeze or air, you're able to feel the touch, right? Fire or light is connected with the sense of sight. Water is connected with the sense of taste. Earth is connected with the sense of smell. Now, there is one school of philosophy called Nyaya. They have done a very deep study about this connection between the objects, the senses, the objects, and so on. And although it's a different school of philosophy, Vedanta doesn't argue with everybody just for the sake of arguing. So Nyaya has done a pretty good job of analyzing this. So Vedanta said, okay, that's great. So Vedanta just accepts what they have said, because it's a very interesting way of describing the connection between the objects or the elements and the senses. In fact, I remember I had studied it years ago. There is a small little book, if you are interested, because Nyaya philosophy itself is pretty intricate. A small book called Tarka Sangraha, which will give you some of these ideas that are discussed here, if you want to go in a greater detail about these things. For instance, it says, Sa Gandhavati Prithvi. This Prithvi is Gandhavati. And you can see the first rain of the season. If you go out into the fields, the first rain, there is a kind of an aroma comes from the soil. And so that's how they kind of associate each element with the particular senses. So this is what we hear in verse 74. The evolution of the gross from the subtle, the relationship of the 5 senses with the sense impressions. Let's go to verse 75. Ya esha mudha vishayeshu baddha ragorupashena sudurdamena आयान्ति निर्यान्ति अध ऊर्ध्वमुच्चैः स्वकर्म दूतेन जवेन नीताः. Those fools who are tied to these objects with the painful noose of attachment are carried back and forth by their own karma to higher and lower realms. You will see in this book and in many other Vedanta books, they don't hesitate to call a fool a fool. They're not being very politically correct or anything. They're just like, no, if this is what you do, you are a fool. So the word for fool here is mudha. Now, what is being described here is something all of you are already familiar with, but just to refresh your memory, this is the chain reaction. Who are tied to these objects with a painful noose of attachment. So, the chain begins with attachment. You will find this chain described also in the Gita in the second chapter. I believe it's verses 62 and 63. So, attachment. Attachment leads to desire. Now, very briefly, it's like this. All of the thoughts that we think, all the actions that we do will have some consequences, will produce some results. Every action generally produces two results. One is an experiential result. The other is a very subtle result. So, if I drink a cup of coffee, latte in Starbucks, and if I enjoy it, then it has actually produced two results. That drinking one cup of coffee has led to two results. The experiential result is it has made me happy. That's one result. The second result is it has created a coffee samskara in my mind. Now, if I've already been drinking lots of coffee, then lots and lots of coffee samskaras are already there in my mind. And if I've been drinking a lot, clearly I'm attached to coffee. So, those samskaras will get activated. The samskaras remain in the unconscious part of the mind. We're not always aware of them, but they are all there. But they get triggered by some external stimulus or internal memory as well. So either you're passing by a Starbucks and then that samskara inside comes up as a desire, let me go and have a cup of coffee. Or if you suddenly remember, oh, yesterday I had coffee and that was so delicious. So that memory also can trigger that samskara and come up as a desire. And that desire comes up to the conscious part of the mind. Just like a boiling water, the bubbles start at the bottom of the container and the bubbles come up on the surface. The desire comes up on the surface. And only when it comes in the conscious part of the mind, we become aware of it. Now, once that desire comes up, there are really two things we can do. So there is our willpower then gets into action, looks at that desire. Now it's the willpower that has to take a decision. Whether this desire that has come, should I act upon it or should I ignore it? That's the judgment call that the willpower has to do. So once the willpower says, I think that's a good desire, I think I like it. And so then this willpower goes and grabs that desire. As soon as the willpower grabs that desire, it becomes an intention. So the word for desire in Sanskrit is vasana. When the will grabs it, it becomes a sankalpa. So intention is sankalpa. And once it becomes an intention, then karma follows, action. It's like this. A desire for coffee comes and then the willpower says, go for it. And then I start walking towards Starbucks or walking towards my kitchen to fix a cup of coffee. So, desire, intention, action. And after that action, you go and get a cup of coffee and you drink it. Again, one more samskara. and then more joy. Or if you drink too much coffee, then sorrow. Either of those. Now, this is just one example of the coffee that I gave. We are doing hundreds and thousands of actions throughout the day. Just imagine how much samskara we have been adding all the time. And the reason our elders have told us from the childhood, think good thoughts, read good books, have good friends. The reason is, the more my mind remains in the company of what is good and positive and holy, those positive, holy, healthy samskaras will enter into my mind. So all of these samskaras are the seeds for future desires and future actions. And I said in the beginning that with death, the body dies with death. But the subtle body, where the samskaras are stored, the subtle body doesn't die. That subtle body then acquires another body that will, what kind of body is determined by laws we don't know. The Gita said they are inscrutable. All that we know is since in nature we see the law of least resistance, generally. So, it is believed that the kind of body that we get in another birth will be one which will look at these samskaras, look at this karma and say, this body will be ideal to work out these samskaras and to work out these karma. And accordingly we get the body. So in a way, our own karma, our own samskara chooses the body. Not in the sense that somebody is going to come and ask you, okay, choose what kind of body you want. Not in that way. But whatever samskaras we have gathered in our life, whatever karma that we have gathered, all those together will determine the kind of body we will get. So, if I have accumulated samskaras and karma which are very animal-like, then nature says, no point in giving this person a human body, because the samskaras are best expressed and experienced in an animal body. So, if an animal body will be more suitable to work out those karma, then a person will get an animal body. So that's what is meant by saying we choose our body. Our own samskaras, our own karma determines where we will go. And that is what is described here by saying the painful noose of attachment are carried back and forth by their own karma to higher and lower realms. Now, higher and lower is a very kind of a relative way of speaking. But in a spiritual text, we could say that those realms which either take us closer to our reality are higher, and those realms which kind of drag us down away from that reality into this kind of the more and more material things, away from the spiritual, those would be lower realms. So that's how we understand higher and lower realms. So let's quickly see next two verses and before we stop. Shabdadibhiv panchabhireva pancha panchattvamapu swagunena baddhaha kuranga matanga patanga meena bhrunga naraf panchabhiranchitav kim. Some of this Sanskrit is so beautiful. It's very, I'm not a musician, but if someone had the musical sense, they will just love it if you're able to see the rhythm behind them. The attraction to even one of these five sense objects, such as sound, etc., becomes the cause of death to a deer, an elephant, a moth, a fish, and a bee. What then to speak of the human being who is attracted to all of these five? So it's a very beautiful word, very powerful, something that should make us think. And what it says is, they've given 5 examples of animals. How, when these animals need to be trapped, or how they meet their death, is because of their almost like fatal attraction to one of these sense objects. So, sound is deer, touch is elephant, light is moth, taste is fish. That's why you put the bait while catching fish, and smell for a bee. That's how a bee goes to the honey in this thing. So what is being said is these 5 animals have attraction, a fatal attraction to one of these sense objects, and that potentially leads to their death. Human beings, we are attracted to all of these 5. So our job is much tougher. Animals seem to be a bit more lucky in this way. I don't know what animals think about their own situation. So how deadly this is in our case is expressed in the next verse. Doshena tivro vishaya krishna sarpa vishadapi visham nihanti bhoktaram trashtaram chakshusapyayam. A sense object is more poisonous than even the poison of a snake. The poison kills a person only when it is consumed, where an object can destroy a person when it is merely seen. Pretty clear, pretty obvious that the poison, we need to have direct contact with poison in order for it to act upon us. But these objects, sense objects, there is no direct contact needed. Even from a distance, it can lead to a spiritual death. What it means is that when the mind and the senses go out, the self is forgotten, the Atman is forgotten, and that is tantamount to spiritual death. I'm reminded of a similar analogy, but in a very different context, given by Sant Tulsidas in the Ramayana. So there he's comparing butter with the heart of a saint. So he says that to melt the butter, you need to heat it. It needs direct contact with heat for the butter to melt. But he says the heart of a saint melts with compassion, seeing the sufferings of people. Even though the saint may not be suffering themselves, just looking at the suffering of people, the heart of a saint melts. While butter, so it is softer than even butter, because butter melts only with direct contact with heat. So I was reminded of that here. As I said, the context is different. Here it says that the poison of a snake needs direct contact. The snake cannot simply look at us and then we are like, of course, sometimes people be terrified and fall down, but you wouldn't get poisoned by simply looking at a snake. But simply looking at it, these objects of sense objects, it can be a spiritual death for us. Okay, so I will stop here now. And if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, feel free to ask. The first question, in the way that willpower can cut the karma chain reaction by stopping a desire from becoming an intention, are there ways to stop an impression from becoming a desire? No, there is no way to stop an impression from being a desire. So as we can see, desires themselves are not problematic, because desires can come. If there is a samskara, a desire is possible. what we need is alertness. What we need is a strong willpower. What we need is viveka, discernment. So, a willpower that is alert, that is awake, that doesn't do things rashly and in a kind of a reflexive way, who is willing to pause a moment, look at the desire, ask whether that desire is healthy, positive, in my self-interest, something that will make me a better person. And so all desires are not bad. If the willpower determines that this desire is good for me, then the willpower should make it into an intention. It should translate into action. So if I have a samskara, say, taking exercises daily, so if that samskara produces a desire, take exercises. So the will shouldn't say, oh, it's a desire, I should run away from it. No. That the willpower says, let me look at it. Oh yes, it's a good desire. Then transform it into an intention, put it into action. So do not impulsively think of desire is bad. Don't think it that way. Desires can be good, they can be bad. Desires can be healthy, they can be unhealthy. We just need a kind of an alert gateman to determine what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. That's it. Oh yeah. So there is this quote one of you has written about. I must first look within and then look outside while remaining within. I believe it was mentioned in one of my blogs. The idea is where we are rooted. If we are rooted inside, in the presence of the divine, in the presence of God, in the presence of the self, and rooted there, if I look at the world, the chances that I will make mistake become considerably less. But if I'm not rooted inside, if I'm just rooted at this external level of the body and mind, and then I'm already outside and I'm looking outside, then there is nothing to ground me, I don't have a stable ground to stand on, because the body and mind are not stable. They are continually, they're material, so they are continually changing. So if I'm standing on shifting sands, then I will fall, I will slip. So first I must stand on a very stable ground, and that is what is meant by saying going within, and then you look outside while staying within. That's the idea. Next. Aren't the things we are negating as non-self God itself? So is the non-self also Atman, if the non-self makes a connection to the self? No. Atman alone is. So we cannot say the Atman is the Anatman, because the Anatman doesn't exist. It's an appearance. So just like when we mistake a rope for a snake, we could say, well, the snake is nothing but the rope. Yes, ultimately, we say that because there is no snake. There is only the rope. So there are no two entities, the rope and the snake, for me then to say the snake is the rope. So there are no two entities, the non-self and the self, because the self alone exists. So the non-self is only an appearance that feels like it's real, but it's not really real. Just like a dream is an appearance. It feels as if it is real while we are dreaming. But when we wake up, we know it didn't really exist. It's exactly like that. Next. It appears to me that the word sukshma body, subtle body, better translated as raw material or building blocks for the sthula body. I think you mean element here, not body. Sukshma elements. Yes, sukshma elements, if you want to think of it as a raw material, feel free to do so. But it's not the sukshma body. Next. If each of us is having all these layers and the Atman is covered under it, where Atman is the only one, does that mean only one of us is the true one by whom Atman can be experienced and the rest is Maya? This is it's a very good question, but could be little potentially unsettling. So, be strong and then listen to what I say. Even if it doesn't make sense, just listen and see what it means. The Atman is only one, yes. And yet, now if I see people around me and I see, well, just like I have a body, I have a mind, I have the Atman, it makes sense to think, well, everyone in front of me, they have a body, they have a mind, and they have the Atman. So the Atman in all of us is one and the same. The example that is given is that if we have 10 containers or 10 buckets filled with water and you leave them out in the sun, and the sun comes up in the morning and you have a nice little drone maybe and then you're looking at those 10 buckets. Now you will find from a right angle, you will find 10 reflections of the sun. If there are 10 buckets, you're going to see 10 reflections. Now, each of those reflections will be a full sun. It won't be like 1/10 of the sun in each. It will be a full sun. So, essentially, there will be 11 suns. 10 reflections and the original one. So when we say there are many Atman, the Atman in everybody, we are really talking about the reflections. Because the real Atman is only one, just like the real sun is only one. Now up to this point, it's fine. I don't think the frightening part hasn't come here yet. But then the question is, who am I? Am I the reflection? Or am I the real sun? Now the problem is, if I am the real sun, the sun is only one. Which leads to this, a way of understanding ourselves and the world, which in Vedic times, they often imparted to what is called the Uttama Adhikari, the highest category of students. And I'm sure many of you who are here belong to that category or would like to belong to that category sooner or later. So I'm going to share that with you. See what you think about it. So there are these two ways of looking at it. These are in Sanskrit. It's called Aneka Jivavada and Eka Jivavada. How many jivas are there? That's another way of asking the same question. How many Atmans are there? So generally, we believe all of us are struggling souls, and we find in the teachings of Ramakrishna also, he gives this example about the fish that are caught, so how some fish get caught, some fish never get caught. He's trying to explain the kind of understanding that most of us have. That here is this world, there are people who don't care for the higher life. They are like the fish who are already caught in the net of Maya. And then there are those who are struggling to get out of the net, the spiritual seekers, who want to become free. And from among these spiritual seekers, some people become free and kind of escape out of that net. And that is why we then think about people who are enlightened and the rest of us who are unenlightened. So this is the way the thinking goes. And it's a very valid way of thinking. There's nothing wrong with it. So that's one way. But what it assumes is that there are many jivas. One by one they will become free. Some have already become free. Some will eventually become free. That's the thinking. Now, there's another way to look at this whole thing. And that's called Ekajivavada, which means there is only one jiva. There are not many. There is only one Atman. Now, to understand this, think about it this way. Most Vedanta students agree that the reality is one. We say that that infinite, unbounded reality is called Brahman. Okay, here there's complete agreement. Now, what if Brahman fell asleep? What would happen if Brahman fell asleep? Now, don't ask me, is it possible? No, it's not possible. That's why I said, what if? And with our understanding of sleep, we can kind of speculate what could happen. What happens when we fall asleep? Suppose I am all alone and in my room, I have a nice dinner, I go to sleep. So sleep really means then I forget who I am, I forget where I am. That's how the sleep comes on me. And then I start dreaming. Now, I may be alone in my house, but that doesn't mean in the dream also I'm all alone. In the dream, I'm just filled with people and animals and trees and mountains and everything. That's the world in which I live for the next few hours as long as I'm dreaming. Then when I wake up in the morning, once again I find, oh, I'm all alone. All of those animals and people and everything had disappeared. Because the reality was, I was alone, I fell asleep, I dreamt. When I woke up, I found I'm alone. Brahman falls asleep, forgets I am Brahman, projects this big cosmic dream. Billions of people, animals, viruses, everything is there. And Brahman then becomes one of these people in the dream. You see, even in our dreams, sometimes we say, oh, last night I dreamt, I went here, I went there. Now, the entire dream world was created by my mind. I was that whole dream. I was that dream myself. That dream didn't exist anywhere outside. I created it. And in that dream, I looked at this one person and determined that's me. And so, while the whole dream is me, I kind of narrowed myself down, limited myself down to this one person in that dream who I thought was me. And whatever that person did in that dream, next morning I wake up and tell everybody, last night in my dream I did this, I did that. That's what has happened to Brahman. Infinite Brahman falls asleep, dreaming, this big cosmic dream with people and animals and everything. And this Brahman looks at one human being and says, that's me. So every one of us, that sense of I that I have is that Brahman who is asleep, thinking that's me. And so when I wake up, when I become a Buddha, Buddha means one who is awake. When I wake up, this whole dream vanishes. And I find, well, I was Brahman all along. In other words, there were never many Atmans. There were never many Jivas. There is only one Jiva, and that's me. All others, living and non-living, Material objects are living beings. They are objects of my perception. The subject is only one. So these are two ways of looking at it. Both the ways are fine. You can attain to the enlightenment following either of those two ways. So don't feel compelled to think that one of this is better or one of this is wrong. It's not. They both are equally good. So I just wanted to share with you in response to this very good question that you asked. Are the Sukshma bodies and the koshas both exoteric and esoteric, inner and outer? Well, I haven't come to the koshas yet, but they are interrelated. And maybe when we come to the kosha section, that will become more clear. But both are ways of dissecting the coverings over the Atman. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Isn't the force by which the absolute becoming the manifest also God? Not very clear. The force by which the absolute becoming the manifest. There is, although we might use the word force and things like that, the reality is there is nothing has manifested. Again, I know that answer is not satisfactory. And so therefore people speak about Shakti, the power or the force, as you say. And so we could say that whatever seems to manifest appears by the power of the divine. And that's how this idea of Shakti comes in. But in Vedantic discussion, Shakti doesn't play too prominent a role, because the idea is just a mistaken perception. There's this quote from the 13th chapter, Kshetram chapi mam vidhi sarva kshetreshu bharata. Yeah, so whatever is real in anything that is seen, that reality is Brahman. The reality is consciousness. The idea is everything is superimposed on God. Just like every part of the snake is superimposed on the rope. So we could say that the snake is nothing but the rope, only in the sense that the snake is not really there at all. That's the idea. So we will stop here today, and if there are some questions that have not been addressed, I know these topics will come up again in future classes as well, and we can look at them at that time. One of the things I would encourage you to do is try to refine your questions before asking. Try to make the questions as simple as possible. But simple in the sense, even if we don't understand something, we need to understand what we have not understood. And so that sometimes when we are not clear what is not clear to us, then when we try to express it, that expression also is not very clear. So that was one thing that my Vedanta teacher taught me many years ago. And that was that if any question comes in the mind, hold on to that question. See how that question can be phrased and rephrased and refined in a way that it best expresses what it is that you don't know, what it is that you don't understand. And when that process of refining the question is taken to its logical conclusion, oftentimes, and it's a miracle, oftentimes you will find the answer will be embedded in the question itself. All that we need to do is keep on refining the question. All this will happen in course of time as we continue the study. I'm sure our ideas will become clearer, and we'll be able to feel good about our understanding and practice of Vedanta. So we'll stop here now. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Oh, before that, on Sunday, for the satsang at 11, our subject will be God is seeing me. And next Wednesday, we'll continue the study of Vivekachudamani. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.